Anything solid can be liquefied by a single word. I learned this in the silence of our hallway, the same hallway I had painted a shade of cream, thinking it was the color of peace. He handed me an envelope, and for the first time in 10 years, his hands were trembling more than mine. There was a weight to that gesture, a hesitation I had never seen in him. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. They were fixed on a random spot on the wall, the exact spot where our nephew's small handprint had been for 3 years, a mark only I knew how to clean dot in that moment. He said nothing, but the silence was thicker than any argument we had ever had. And as I took the envelope, my mind wasn't there, in the present. It traveled a year back in time, to that same hallway. Back then, his hands were firm, planted on his hips, and his laugh echoed with a cruel certainty as he spoke the words that would become the foundation of everything that came next. A sentence he thought was a period, but for me, was the sound of the starting gun. This isn't a story about a marriage that ended. It's about a woman who began. It's the story of how the greatest humiliation of my life became the deed to my freedom, and how the men who sentenced me to nothingness returned to ask me for shelter. If stories like this resonate with you, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. I was the kind of woman who loved in capital letters. I believed that love was total surrender, a daily sacrifice on the altar of a shared life. And I was a faithful devotee. My religion was his well-being, the harmony of our home. I was the CEO of a household that he treated like a 5-star hotel, with included room service. I managed the finances, the renovations, the dinners with his friends, his peace of mind. I was the invisible architect of a world everyone admired, but whose work no one, especially him, acknowledged. Love, for me, was a perfectly organized spreadsheet, a pantry that was always full, a shirt that was always pressed. And I thought that was enough. I thought being the foundation was the same as being the castle. Our life, from the outside, was the picture of happiness. A beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, smiles and travel photos, the appearance of a perfect partnership. But that perfection was a thin layer of varnish over wood that was rotting from the inside. Today, I know that what was corroding our structure had a name. In their research, psychologists John and Julie Gottman identified the 4 greatest poisons in a relationship: criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and the worst of them all, contempt. And his contempt didn't show up in our fights. It was much more subtle. It was a homeopathic poison, administered in small, daily doses. It was in the way he'd look at me over his laptop when I talked about my day, in the disinterested "oh, really?" in the way he'd tell a story to his friends as if I wasn't in the room. He didn't criticize me openly. He simply erased me gently, every single day. And I, blinded by my own devotion, mistook contempt for distraction and invisibility for peace. I was losing myself, believing I was loving. Intuition is an ancient voice, a whisper that comes from generations of women who had to learn to read the air to survive. My inner voice started to scream, but I locked it in the basement of my mind. It was easier to believe the illusion. The signs were all there, like little red flags planted in our perfect garden. I remember a dinner party with his business partners. I spent 2 days planning everything. The menu, the decor, the music. Midway through the night, a guest complimented the food, and he laughed, throwing his arm around my shoulder. "She's got a knack for these things. It's her little hobby," he said. Hobby. The word hung in the air, and only I felt its weight. My 48 hours of work, reduced to a trivial pastime. It was around that time I started my small online business. From the same kitchen table where I planned menus, I began to build something of my own. It was an e-commerce shop for handmade goods, something small, but it gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond choosing the right fabric softener. I tried to talk to him about it. I showed him the website, the first few sales. He glanced at it for 10 seconds, gave a condescending smile, and said, "That's cute, honey. Good for you to keep yourself busy. As if my life wasn't already an endless sequence of unpaid occupations to support his world. The escalation continued. Major financial decisions about our money were made without consulting me. "You don't need to worry about that," he'd say, patting my hair, a gesture I once saw as affection, but began to understand as an act of silencing. There was a moment, one night, when the truth almost surfaced. I saw him in his office, late at night, on a video call. The door was ajar, and I heard his voice, different, animated, full of an energy he hadn't directed at me in years. My heart pounded. I knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that he wasn't talking about work. I backed away into the darkness of the hall before he could see me. That night, I convinced myself it was paranoia. I clung to the need to be wrong about the man I loved more than the need to honor my own perception. Intuition is rarely wrong about the facts. What's wrong is our desperate hope that it is. And as I soothed myself with that lie, I didn't know that on the other side of town, the foundation of my life had already been demolished. I just hadn't received the demolition notice yet. The end didn't come with an explosion, but with the coldness of a business transaction. It was a Tuesday. I remember the afternoon sun streaming through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I was folding a pile of clean laundry, the fresh scent filling the room. He walked in, sat on the opposite sofa, and waited for me to finish. There was no anger on his face, no sadness. There was the terrifying calm of an irrevocable decision. He talked about futures that didn't align, about paths that were diverging, about someone else who was more in sync with who he was becoming. We're halfway through. If you're already feeling the power of this transformation, make sure you're subscribed to see how this story of empowerment unfolds. His words were like stones, but none of them hit me. They fell around me untouched. I was in a state of shock, a spectator watching my own life being dismantled. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just watched him, as if studying a rare specimen. When he finished his rehearsed speech, silence filled the room. And it was in that silence that I asked the only question that mattered. What about the house? Our life? He looked at me, and for the first time in that conversation, an emotion flickered across his face. It wasn't pity. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. He let out a small laugh, a sound that scratched my soul. And then he said it. He pronounced the sentence. What are you going to do without me? You're just a housewife. Trauma is not what happens to you. As Dr. Gabor Mat says, it's what happens inside you. And inside of me, in that split second, something shattered. And where it broke, something new, made of steel, began to form. The pain was so sharp, so piercing, it transformed into absolute clarity. It wasn't about the end of love. It wasn't about the betrayal. It was about the complete annihilation of who I was. He didn't see my 24 hours of daily work, my dedication, my sacrifice. He saw a void, a dependent, an accessory. And in that sun-drenched room, with the smell of clean laundry in the air, I understood. I wasn't losing a husband. I was being given a challenge. And silently, I accepted it. The first few days were a blur of grief. I cried for a week. I cried for the woman I was, for the illusion I had nurtured, for the life I thought I had. But every tear seemed to water a seed of righteous anger sprouting in my chest. It wasn't an anger that sought revenge. It was an anger that demanded justice. Justice for the woman he tried to erase. As Brené Brown teaches, true courage isn't about never feeling fear or pain, but about choosing to enter the arena, even when we're wounded. And my arena was that house. My weapon would be silence, while he packed his things, whistling softly as if he were moving on to a better place. I began my own operation. The first call was to a lawyer, a woman with a steady gaze who made me feel heard for the first time in years. Together, we dove into the paperwork, and we discovered something crucial. Years ago, I had used a small inheritance from my grandmother to make the down payment on that house. A detail he had forgotten. A detail I myself had downplayed. Legally, that gave me an advantage he was unaware of. The second step was opening a separate bank account. Seeing my name, and only my name, at the top of that document was like breathing fresh air after a decade underwater. And then, I turned to my hobby. My little business at the kitchen table became my headquarters. All the time and energy I had dedicated to him, I redirected to myself. The late nights I spent worrying about his sleep, I spent optimizing my website. The afternoons I spent at the grocery store, I spent negotiating with suppliers. I learned about digital marketing, logistics, customer service. My home, once a sanctuary for his comfort, became my business incubator. The little hobby began to grow silently, like a strong vine climbing a wall. Sales doubled, then tripled, and he had no idea. He would call sometimes to ask practical questions about old bills, always in that tone of someone speaking to an assistant, and I would answer, calmly, politely, while on my other screen, I was closing a deal that would pay the mortgage for that month. Transformation is an inside job, and when you choose to transform instead of retaliate, you've already won the war before the final battle. I was building my empire on the very ground where he thought there were only ruins. 6 months passed. 6 months of silence and construction. I heard through mutual friends that his new relationship wasn't the fairy tale he had imagined. That real life was more complicated than fantasy. I felt nothing. Not joy. Not pity. I was too busy watering my own garden to worry about the weeds in his. Until, on a rainy November night, the doorbell rang. It was him, drenched, smaller than I remembered, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't have to say much. The story was written on his face. He needed a place to stay, just for a little while, he said, until I get back on my feet. He looked at our old house with the familiarity of someone who feels they own the place. He expected me to take him in, perhaps with a bit of resentment, but that in the end, the housewife who took care of everything would take care of him one more time. I invited him in. I offered him coffee. We talked about trivial things, and then, with the same calm I used to serve him dinner, I presented him with the truth. I pulled a folder from my work desk, the old dining table. Inside, there were documents. I explained the legal situation of the house, my inheritance investment, the way the mortgage payments had been made for the last 6 months, exclusively by my company. The company that was a hobby. His eyes went wide. The shock was followed by denial, and then by a slow, painful understanding. The house was mine. Legally, morally, financially. It was mine. But don't worry, I said, using the same phrase he had so often used to silence me. I'm not going to leave you out on the street. I opened the folder again and slid a document across the table toward him. You can stay, I said, my voice steady. If you can pay the rent. In front of him was a lease agreement. Simple, standard, with a line for the tenant's signature. And on the landlord's line, there it was, my name, mine alone. The silence that followed was the most beautiful symphony I have ever heard. There were no shouts, no tears. Just the soft sound of a pen against paper, signing the final confession of his defeat and the irrevocable declaration of my independence. He was my tenant for 6 months. It was strange but necessary. Every bank transfer he made was a reminder, not for him, but for me, of my own worth. He eventually moved out. We don't speak anymore, and I forgave him, not because he asked for it or deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Forgiveness was the last item I packed away from our old life before putting it in a box and storing it in the attic of my memory. Today, I live in the same house, but it's a different place. The walls no longer muffle my voice. They echo with my laughter and my business calls. The kitchen table is no longer an altar of service. It is my throne. From here, I run my life and my company, which now employs 5 other women. Looking back, I've learned lessons that are more valuable than any property. The first is that financial autonomy isn't a luxury. It's a form of self-love. It's the key that ensures you will never be trapped in a place where you are not valued. The second is that the unpaid labor of caring for a home and a family is real work, and some of the hardest work there is. Assign value to it, even if the world doesn't. And the third, perhaps the most important, when someone defines you with the phrase, "You're just a," remember that the sentence isn't a description of you. It's a confession of the limits of their own vision. He was the one who was just a man, incapable of seeing the universe that existed in me. If this story inspired you, show it with a like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to build our own worth together.